The deterioration of Canada-US relations has provoked renewed calls for Ottawa to reduce our trade dependence on the United States. The appointment of a minister for international trade diversification is just the latest manifestation of this political trend. China is often touted as a or even the trade partner who can rescue us from reliance on the US market, including most recently by China's ambassador to Canada. Proponents of this strategy call for Canada to abandon its stubborn fixation on the US market and focus on China, seen as global trade's adult in the room. This thinking overlooks many inconvenient facts about the continental structure of the Canadian economy, the sheer size of Canada-US trade, and the basic problems of trade with China. The reality is, a sizable diversification of Canadian trade is highly improbable, and free trade with China is fraught with serious economic and security problems. For Canada, there is no credible substitute for secure and stable access to the US market. Concerns about NAFTA uncertainty are certainly fully justified. 20% of our economy, roughly 2 million jobs, come from exports to the United States. Estimates of the magnitude of diminished investment and job losses vary, but the cost of NAFTA's disappearance would be heavy, particularly for trade-sensitive sectors. And these assessments likely underestimate the further harm that post-NAFTA uncertainty would do to business investment. But that does not make China the answer to our US problem. The underlying assumptions of the China solution are two. First, the Chinese market can take Canadian exports previously destined for the United States. And second, free trade with China can be rules-based, reliable, and ultimately in Canada's interests. Both of these assumptions are false. The idea that we can replace the Canada-US trade relationship with others neglects the integration of our industries and supply chains within North America. Canadian auto parts suppliers, agricultural exporters, financial and legal services firms, energy infrastructure, and so on are deeply tied into our shared continental economy. Politicians can speculate about trade diversification, but their strategies cannot counteract centuries-old insights about specialization and the division of labor, nor the business decisions of countless Canadian enterprises. Claims about Canada's over-reliance on the US ignore that most global trade is regional, especially in intermediate goods as opposed to finished products like those Canada does well in. Think auto parts versus finished automobiles, for example. And this is, of course, intuitive. Proximity, being close, has various advantages, including transportation costs and common standards, interests, and practices. Yet Canada's trade is actually less concentrated than Australia's and more diversified than many EU member states. America, the world's largest economy, is right next door, and other markets are literally oceans away. Nor can China substitute for the US. It takes less than 5% of total Canadian exports. The US takes over 70%, and that number will be exceedingly hard to increase substantially. One of the biggest obstacles to doing so is China's own behavior. As Macdonald-Laurier Institute Senior Fellow Duanji Chen has written, China is a true outlier in global trade. Its large trade surpluses, including a $40 billion one with Canada, are driven at least in part by its refusal to grant its trading partners, like Canada, reciprocal access to its own market. Indeed, far from becoming more open to trade, China's Made in China 2025 plan will make China more closed to foreign companies in many key industries. Similarly, China's track record of using cyber and other forms of espionage, as well as licensing and joint ventures to gain control of foreign intellectual property, is deeply worrisome. But this actually pales in comparison to the serious national security challenges associated with unfettered access for Chinese enterprises to our domestic market. Those persist regardless of whether such enterprises are private or state-owned, which is a largely meaningless distinction when all companies in China must kowtow to their internal cell of the Communist Party. Recent international attention to the security risks posed by China's major wireless firm, Huawei, is only the latest example. China has long refused to distinguish between commercial and national interests, making Chinese companies effectively agents of the Chinese state. As long as this is so, Ottawa must preserve its ability to act energetically to protect our national security. Finally, we cannot ignore that governments have in recent years made Canada a high-cost place to do business. We can compete with the US, barely, often by letting the loonie fall and lowering our own standard of living. But the idea that we would be cost competitive with China is a pipe dream. There are reasons we have a $40 billion trade deficit with China, and a free trade agreement won't make those reasons go away. Yes, NAFTA uncertainty is a huge headache, but throwing in our lot with China isn't the solution, even if it were possible. Our so-called stubborn fixation on the United States isn't some misguided, centrally planned boondoggle, but is rather the sum of millions of informed choices by firms, markets, and individuals every day. Ottawa cannot turn it on and off like a light bulb. Only China's government can do that, which, incidentally, is reason in itself not to see China as the solution to our momentary woes. I'm Brian Lee Crowley for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute.